a little more technical economics relating to the public sector. How do we decide what the government should do? Good question. Again, our Constitution gets interpreted two ways. One is that it contains this phrase, general welfare, and some other vague phrases that we haven't talked about yet, and that those vague phrases empower the government to do just about anything. In that case, of course, then we have a lot of parsing down to do to see what it is exactly that the government's going to do. Other people argue that there's a list of very explicit things in the Constitution for the government to do, and the government should limit itself to those things. We don't have as much to discuss if that is our point. I put this fire department scene up here for a reason. We tend to think of fire departments as belonging to cities or counties, but in fact, there are private fire departments out there, and there are cities where the fire business is a private business. And if your house catches on fire and you don't have fire insurance, you didn't pay the fire department, they'll still come out to your house, but not to put the fire out, just to make sure that your fire doesn't catch on to people who did pay. So it's possible to have private fire. It's not necessarily a public good. There are places that have electrical companies that are owned by the city. So these questions of what the government should do are big questions. Then we have another question which sounds simple but is actually really hard, and that's how do we figure out whether the government is doing well at its job or poorly at its job? Is the police doing a good job? Is UNLV doing a good job? How do we evaluate these things? There are a variety of categories we look at. The first one is something called allocation, and that means allocation of resources, the land, the labor, the capital. Whenever the government does something, it's changing how resources are allocated. If the government gets more involved in the healthcare system, it will change the way resources are allocated within the healthcare system, and it also may bring more resources into the system than were there before. It changes the allocation. So some people in the private sector are going to end up with fewer resources, and the government or other places in the private sector are going to end up with more resources. Whether that change in allocation is beneficial to society or not beneficial to society is the question. How does the allocation of resources affect us? So we're interested in this idea of efficiency. Efficiency is getting the most out for what we put in. If we are efficient, if we are as economically efficient as possible, that would mean that it is impossible to change the allocation of resources and get more output. We're maximizing. So we measure how much we're producing. There is no chance that we're producing at 100% efficiency. If you ever have a job, you know that everybody who works for whoever is not 100% efficient. You know that there's inefficiency out there. And what that means is that there isn't going to be one point that is the best point. And we have to figure out among all the possible outcomes that we might choose, which one is the right one for us. We also have this concept called distribution, and that has to do with income, essentially. Whenever the government acts, it's going to make some people richer and some people poorer. When the government expands the military contractors are doing better. They're going to make more money. The people who work for them are going to make more money. Somebody else in society is going to get less because of that. Can we say that society is better off after the government has redistributed the income? Intentionally or unintentionally redistributed the income. And coupled to this, remember, is this idea of incentives. Economists are always worried about incentives. What incentives exist in the system? If the government's putting a lot of money into defense, there's an incentive for companies to get involved in that business. If the military is shrinking, there's an incentive for companies to go do other things. So we see incentives for individuals, incentives for companies being altered as the government changes its policies. Now you may remember this idea, hopefully you remember this idea of utility, which means happiness. One of the keys to understanding utility is that it's really not measurable. We can't measure how happy we are. We may say, hey, I'm happier today than I was yesterday. Okay, how much happier? A lot? There's no way to actually measure happiness. You can't say, I got 32 utils from that. Or, I like this song 2.6 times more than I like that song. Because we can't actually measure utility, we can't legitimately compare one person's happiness to another. There are times when I can say, I'm happier than you are. But there are other times when we're both happy, and I don't know that I'm happier than you or you're happy. Right? We're just happy. We call comparison between people interpersonal utility comparison. You cannot make legitimate interpersonal utility comparisons. You cannot take money from one person and give it to another person and conclude that the happiness of society went up. Even if you're taking $5 from a really rich person and giving it to a really poor person, and you would think, hey, that really rich person is not going to miss it, that really poor person really likes it. Maybe the reason that person who's really rich is because they obsessively compulse over every dime they have, and maybe the poor person is happy to have that $5, but not as happy as the. You see what I'm saying? We can't make these comparisons. A long time ago, this guy up there, he's Italian. His name is Vilfredo Pareto. And he told us about this situation. He said, this is the way the world is. So there's only one way you can make sure, that society is better off, and that's if you make no one worse off and at least one person better off. So the only way the government can be sure what it's doing makes society better off is to make nobody worse off and at least one person better off. Well, if you think about that, that's never going to happen, right? Pareto optimality is never going to happen. That means that most of the evaluations that go on in the public sector are going to be political, not economic. We can make economic statements about things. We know, and I've already said this, and we may talk about this again, the United States spends twice as much of its GDP on healthcare as France without getting better healthcare outcomes. We get equal healthcare outcomes. Well, that's an economic advantage, an economic evaluation that tells me that our healthcare system is not efficient. But that doesn't mean, politically speaking, it tells me what to do to fix our healthcare system or how the pluses and minuses of changing the healthcare system would affect those calculations. Okay. In the background of this, we have this concept called a social welfare function. And the social welfare function is this idea that maybe we can put things in order. Maybe we can rank things. It comes from what we call ordinal utility. Economists believe, again, that you can't measure utility, but you can rank things. You can put them into orders. So you can say, what are your 5 favorite songs? And you can list them. You can't tell me how much more you like your second favorite song than your third favorite song, but you can be fairly confident in this is my favorite song, So we can put things in order. There's some belief that in some way we can rank order what happens, and in doing so create what's called a social welfare function, which is all the possible things we could do put in order from the one we like the most to the one we like the least. Should we be Robin Hood and take from the rich and give to the poor? Well, I've already kind of hinted at this. There's no way to know that you're actually making society better off if you take from the rich and give to the poor. We have this idea that rich people are going to be less concerned about $100 than a poor person, and therefore, if you take the $100 from a rich person, their loss of utility is less than the gain of utility of that poor person who gets that $100, but there's no way to prove that. Okay, there's just flat no way to prove that, and economists are loath to do that. President Kennedy said, "When the tide comes in, all ships rise." He was asked how to fix poverty in America, and he didn't say take from the rich and give to the poor. He said, when the tide comes in, all ships rise. In other words, the way to make everybody better off is to have a bigger pie. Instead of taking and redeciding how much of a pie piece everybody should get, and the rich people get smaller pieces and the poor people get bigger pieces, let's make the whole pie bigger, and then everybody can have a bigger piece. That's Pareto optimality. Kennedy, though, also said, if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. And a lot of the programs we have to take care of kids, like lunch programs and housing support programs and programs to keep kids from going to bed hungry at night, the impetus started when President Kennedy was president. President Johnson actually puts them into effect because President Kennedy isn't around anymore, but it's that early 1960s where we start putting in these social programs because there's this belief that we need to help the poor. So how do we know if we're doing a good job? Well, let's go back to UNLV or a school. How do we know that UNLV is successful? Is it our graduation rate? The Clark County School District was being judged on its graduation rate, and what they did was really simple. They started by counting 11th graders on instead of 9th graders on, and they got rid of the graduation test, and they started giving you 50% on a test even if you didn't take it, and their graduation rate jumped from under 50% to 80-something percent. They're not actually more successful in what they do, they just change the way they figure out the numbers. UNLV is being pushed to increase graduation rates. One way to do that would just be to give everybody C's or above and not have D's or F's. That would not necessarily be proof that we were doing better, and certainly you wouldn't want a nurse or a doctor who had gotten C's because that's the lowest grade we give to be treating you if you're not sick or sticking a needle in your arm. So we know that Utah spends less per student in school than Nevada does, but Utah has much better outcomes. They have higher test scores. Their kids are more likely to go to college. Nothing is simple in these calculations, but if you want to think about this, this is a really useful thing to think about. How do we measure success? What is success for UNLV? Is it what our students are doing 5 years after they graduate? 10 years after they graduate? What they learn? This is a very complex question, and all government programs just about have very complex answers to how we're going to measure what success is for that program. Related to that is this question of value judgments. We make value judgments. We say, that person's smarter than that person, or tall people are better than short people, or whatever it is. We have a tendency in our lives to make value judgments. What matters is often just a value judgment. Is it kids that matter? Is it right now that matters? Is it the future that matters? What is it? When we use value judgments to make decisions, we call that normative. So there's normative economics, which is economics that's tied to our value judgments. So we don't say, okay, what's the best way to make the country better off? We say, we need to make life better for kids, and then figure out how to do that. Okay? Economists are taught what's called positive economics, which is we're taught not to start on the supposition that we need to do something to help kids. We're taught with the supposition to say, what is wrong? How do we figure out what's wrong, or what needs fixed, or what isn't working? Rather than starting by making an assumption about an answer or a problem, we try to make our world free of value judgments, free of using our opinions ahead of time to make decisions. And as you go through this course, you should do that, and you should yell at me if I'm not doing that, even though it's virtually impossible to actually do. Your values are always going to have a role in figuring out what you're doing and what you're studying and what you're thinking about. But you want to try to enter a conversation without a preconceived notion that government is good or bad, or the healthcare system's a mess, or the military's too big or too small, or whatever that preposition is in your head. Try to start from neutral position. Try to be positive, not normative. And then a last set of words here, efficiency and equity. Economists, again, we think you need to have incentives to work hard and incentives to do good things. What that means is, to get us to be efficient, we're going to lose equality. That the system, our capitalist system, we've talked about this before, there's always going to be some inequality in a capitalist system if you want to have efficiency. If you want to encourage people to work hard and be creative and produce more, you have to reward them. And the people who do the best are going to get the most rewards. So we have this trade-off that the more we want things to be equitable in our society, the less efficient we're going to be. And the more efficient we want to be, the more uneven we're going to be. Now, there's more to this story than all that, but this idea of trade-offs is really important in economics. That frequently, to get more of one thing, we have to get less of something else. And we're always being faced with these trade-offs.